The driving issue for the Middle East in 2012 is the rise of Iran. Now that the United States has completed its withdrawal from Iraq, Iran is left as the preeminent military power in the Persian Gulf. This is very unsettling for a lot of regional players who fear the spread of an Iranian-led Shiite arc of influence spreading from Afghanistan to the Mediterranean. And you can bet that efforts are going to be made to try and scuttle Iran's agenda. Now, the Iranians understand well that while this year presents them with a historic opportunity to use its position in Iraq as a launchpad to spread influence in the heart of the Arab world, they're operating on a very limited timeline. The two main checks on Iranian power, the United States and Turkey, are not yet prepared to deal effectively with Iran this year. The United States is still far too distracted, and Turkey is still very early in its rise. But with time, the Turks will eventually be able to fulfill their role as a geopolitical counterbalance to the Persians. And though the U.S. is distracted this year, the virtue of U.S. power lies in its unpredictability. The Iranians can't be sure that the United States will be as constrained a couple years from now, and so they must act now to consolidate their influence as best as they can. Iran's goal is to use its current prowess to try and drive its regional adversaries toward a strategic accommodation that will be favorable to Iranian interests. But there's a big difference between intent and capability. We still see Iran operating under very heavy constraints this year that will prevent it from fundamentally reshaping the politics of the region in its favor. Saudi Arabia will have to make a big decision this year. They're already worried about the potential for Iran to further exploit continued Shiite unrest in Bahrain and in Saudi Arabia's Shiite-concentrated and oil-rich eastern province. The Saudis will do their best to shore up and consolidate the defenses of the Gulf Cooperation Council states to counter Iran, but in the end, the Saudis will be very doubtful over the U.S.'s ability and willingness to guarantee Saudi interests. Given Iran's constraints, we don't think Saudi Arabia will go so far as to strike an accommodation with their Persian rivals. Saudi Arabia will remain in a highly uncomfortable and insecure position, but will choose to remain within the U.S. security framework in the region for lack of better options. Everyone, of course, wants to know what will become of Syria this year. You can see the incentive for Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and the United States to try and bring down the Syrian regime to undermine Iran's influence in the Levant. But this is easier said than done. Without foreign military intervention, which would have to be led by the United States, the Syrian regime is unlikely to fall. So far, we don't see this type of intervention as likely this year. So the regime will continue to struggle in stamping out the unrest, but it has more staying power than most observers are giving it credit for. Now, we can't rule out the possibility of the al-Assad clan being coerced into making a political exit and a sectarian struggle breaking out within the regime as a result. But the key for Iran will be to preserve a regime favorable to Iranian interests in Syria, regardless of the political personality at the helm in Damascus. So long as the regime itself holds together, Iran's influence over Syria will increase tremendously as the regime becomes all the more alienated from its Arab neighbors and all the more dependent on Iran. We will also see the effects of Iran's rise play out prominently in Iraq. Iran's main project for Iraq will be the consolidation of Shiite power, but given the fractious nature of Iraqi Shiite politics, this will be a very high-maintenance and messy affair. Sectarian fissures will again rise to the fore, and a security vacuum will lead to a deterioration in security conditions overall. Also, watch for Iranian and Turkish competition to increase in northern Iraq as Turkey attempts to limit the spread of Iranian influence. We'll hear a lot of rhetoric from Turkey on foreign policy matters in the region, but Turkey is going to be very overwhelmed this year. We don't anticipate Turkey undertaking foreign military adventures, and certainly not alone. Turkey will have to deal with a decline in economic growth from the European crisis, and there are a number of issues, including a controversial set of proposed amendments to the constitution that will keep Turkey internally preoccupied. Moving over to Egypt, it's pretty well understood by now that Egypt's new parliament will likely have a significant Islamist presence. But we believe the military will be able to maintain the paramount authority of the state. The opposition will remain deeply split, playing to the military's advantage. At the top of Israel's concerns is the fact that Egypt's preoccupation in dealing with its economic and political troubles at home will undermine its ability to patrol the Sinai buffer, and thus increase tensions with Israel. Israel will be working on its own contingency military planning, but we still expect both Egypt and Israel to maintain the peace treaty through the year.